Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this important first session of a day of conversations about Canada's role in the world. I'm Robert Greenhill, Executive Chairman of Global Canada, and I'm really delighted to be here with two of the most thoughtful, engaged Canadian leaders on this issue. The Honourable Michael Chong, the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Official Opposition, and Dr. Bessma Momani, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, a Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf Institute in Washington, D.C., and also a co-author of a very important paper that came out a couple of months ago called 10 Strategic Choices for Canadian Decision Makers, which you can find at global-canada.org. The conversation today is really going to focus on two issues. One is, what are some of the key strategic challenges and choices that are facing our leaders when they look at ensuring that Canadian values and interests are well presented and achieved at a very complex international situation? But the second issue, which is equally important, is how do we ensure that Canadians feel part of the process, that it's not just seen as an elite group in their own diplomatic bubble talking about international issues, but Canadians feel that their voices, their views, their perspectives are fully engaged and represented and reflected in what's being discussed internationally. And as part of that process, the Canadian International Council, Global Canada, and CanWatch have announced a deliberative democracy exercise, which over the next few months will be engaging 400 Canadians chosen at random to get their views and perspectives on what's going on in the world and what the values and interests are that Canada should be trying to advance internationally. And we'll be reporting back on that in the next few months. And maybe I could start with that, Michael. Why is it you think that foreign policy should matter to Canadians, and why is it that Canadians' views should matter when diplomats are thinking about our foreign policy?
Well, I think foreign policy should matter because it has a huge impact on 37 million Canadians. We are a society, an economy that is heavily reliant on exports for our prosperity, and making sure that we can continue to rely on those exports to do what we do is incredibly important, more important than most other countries around the world. And foreign policy matters because we're increasingly being buffeted in a very tumultuous world and increasingly isolated. And so all those things are increasingly coming back to hurt us in the recent decade, and we need to pay more attention to foreign policy because of that.
Yes, I mean, I guess the fact we're doing this virtually because we're in the middle of a global pandemic is just one more example of how, we can try to ignore the world, but the world will not ignore us. And what about the issue of engaging Canadians in the conversation? Because if we go back 100 or 200 years, foreign policy was very much an elite art with a diplomatic corps that was quite distinct from the rest of government, let alone the rest of society. Is that really the way it will still be done now, or what's the challenge for Canada when crafting its foreign policy for Canadians?
Yeah, I think our foreign policy needs to have the support of Canadians. I think we need to step up our game in foreign policy. I think it's clear that the foreign policy Canada's had in recent years simply isn't working, whether it's our position vis-a-vis China, whether it's our engagement with other similarly sized liberal democracies. It's clear that we're playing catch up and that we're not in the game, and that's hurting Canadian interests and Canadian values. I think the ordinary person on the street understands that. But in order to have a more robust foreign policy, we need to have broad political support for that, and that starts by engaging Canadians on this file in a way that we traditionally haven't. So I think, the starting point for that more robust foreign policy is, much broader citizen engagement on part of the government to make sure it has the political support in order to go out there and make our case and defend our values and our interests.
Yeah. And it's interesting. In fact, one of your predecessors, the Prime Minister Borden, the Conservative Prime Minister who led Canada through World War I, but perhaps even more importantly, led the Canadian delegation at the League of Nations, where he insisted, after all the blood and treasure that had been sacrificed to Canadians, it wasn't appropriate that we simply be under the imperial umbrella of the conversations, but that Canada's own voice be heard. So a little over 100 years ago at the Paris Peace Treaty, he was there representing Canadians. But interestingly, he was the founder of the Canadian Institute for International Affairs, now the Canadian International Council, who's our partner on this process, because he understood that foreign policy could only be as strong and consistent as there was understanding and support by Canadians from sea to sea. And he played personally a critical role in the 1920s when many people were going backwards on this, to ensure that Canadians across the country understood the importance of global engagement. So in a sense, you're continuing in that important tradition on the Conservative side. And Bessma, one of the points that Michael emphasized is there are a lot of issues out there which we're having difficulty grappling with. And I think one of the takeaways from our report was we can no longer assume that the default case is that the world will unfold in a way that's aligned with Canadian interests and values. For much of the last 30, 40 years, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was like, it'd be nice for us to be more effective, but if we're not, things will still be okay. I think very few people would say that, hope is a good strategy when you're looking at international affairs today. And if the default case is not that it will necessarily go in the right direction, where are the areas we should be pushing on? What are the choices we should be making to ensure that we go the right way? And as I mentioned to the audience, you played a key role as being one of 12 foreign policy experts involved in this, looking at key issues and trends and coming up with some of these choices. Maybe you could share your perspective on how you see the international environment and why trying to identify a few key choices is so important.
Yeah, thank you. And really kudos to you and Jennifer Welch for really shepherding this important report. And I think what I liked about the report was, it was very thoughtful. It was obviously Canadian centric, but it didn't sugarcoat the challenges. And I think this is really important for us to be cognizant of. The world is a far more difficult place to manage, and there's multiple reasons for that. And I think it follows in line with the overall, key global trend that you had pointed out in the report. This idea that we have what's called the rise of the rest. Certainly a lot of non-Western countries are becoming more powerful economically. Of course, China being a really important part of that. But that sort of shift of power to emerging market economies that in their own right are also very nationalistic and increasingly, don't look at the multilateral system in the same way that they did in the past. They see that this is a time for them to shine. They have their own domestic development concerns that don't necessarily, comply or follow sort of the liberal international order. And we also have, I think, a rise of liberal democracies. These are democracies where the act of voting exists, but the very essence of the infrastructure, if you will, of the democratic system is really at risk from, increasingly media is no longer free and fair in a lot of countries. We have a lot more surveillance of civil society organizations, and that you could also blame to sort of technological reality of there are a lot of seductive tools out there, particularly on surveillance, again, monitoring, and even just things like Cambridge Analytica, companies for hire that can be used to manipulate the voter. All of that makes it just more difficult, but ever more important. And then you have the challenges, right? The challenges are increasingly global. I mean, obviously we're in this pandemic, as you pointed out, and obviously, just getting a solution, a vaccine is a global public good, and you would think everybody has a stake in providing, from the scientists to the production process in terms of distribution, all have a stake in making sure that everyone gets a vaccine, because we all know, if we're not all protected, then this pandemic will continue to be rampant. But we're seeing that same kind of, if you will, America first type strategy, and you just multiply that. Every country sort of has their own first strategy, and that is not really helpful to solving these kinds of global public goods. Climate change, of course, is on there as well. So I think we have so many things on our agenda collectively. And the value of, I think, what CIC is trying to do in going out to speak to Canadians is also because it's been too long that a lot of these foreign policy ideas have been generated from a top-down perspective. And I don't think you're going to get the kind of ownership that it needs if you don't have that kind of broad-based participatory process where indeed people have a chance to share what matters to them. And I'll just quickly add, as I summarize, is that, at the same time, Canadians have been told way too long that, foreign policy doesn't matter. I mean, pollsters tell us this. We hear this from, whenever there's leaders debates, for example, foreign policy ends up taking, sorry for that.
Well, Bessma, I think you've gone on mute, but I want to actually build on one of the key points which you had mentioned, which is on the whole issue of the crisis of democratic legitimacy in the world today. That there are so many countries which have had elections, but when they've actually become illiberal democracies, or where the democracies haven't delivered the social goods, the security, the support, the legitimacy that the people are looking for, and there's been a backlash against that. And that there's almost like an authoritarians are us group sharing best practices on how to be manipulating democratic processes, which is a huge challenge in terms of the world we live in. And Michael, you've actually been at the forefront of ensuring that our own democracy here in Canada is vibrant. You led the Reform Act in Parliament with cross-partisan support to put in place some important reforms in our Parliament. When we look at the 10 strategic issues, one of them was, should Canada take a more significant and consequential role in helping to encourage democracies that deliver around the world? Do you have any thoughts or perspectives at the international level on this issue, Michael?
Yeah, I think we have to defend democracy abroad and at home. I think the challenge for democracies is a crisis of confidence. I think the challenge is twofold. First, there's been a crisis of confidence in the liberal democratic principles that underpin liberal democracies. I think we've had increasing debates about these very principles, and they've been called into question. So I think I personally believe that we need to push back, and we need to make the case for democracies, the case for the liberal democratic principles that underpin these democracies and have underpinned these democracies for several hundred years. These are principles about the primacy of the individual over the group, the belief in individual freedoms and liberties, a belief in equality of opportunity, a belief in all the sorts of freedoms and rights that we've long held. So that's the first thing I think first challenge we need to deal with, which is we have to re-articulate these foundational principles and push back at some of the arguments against them that we've seen in many democracies in the last decade. I think the second challenge, as you are implied in your question, is we need to strengthen near democracies around the world, democracies that are struggling. It's clear through various measurements over the last decade that democracies are back on their heels. You look at indices, for example, that The Economist magazine has put out, and you see democracies in retreat. So I don't think we should be so naive as to expect that we're going to change countries like China into a democracy. But there are near democracies like Malaysia, places like that, where we have now increasing relations because of by multilateral agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where we can use our resources to help strengthen those democracies. So, in my view, democracies have a twin threat. It's obviously the threat of increasing authoritarianism from countries like China and Russia, regimes like Iran that are threatening our interests and our values. But equally, I think the challenge is here at home, and not just in Canada, but in other democracies where the very foundational principles that our constitutions are based on are being called into question, and we need political leadership to push back on that challenge, to re-articulate the reason why we have these foundational principles.
Bessma, what was your thought on that?
I mean, I concur completely. And I think I don't just will quickly add as well multilateralism, and many Canadians would always question sort of, why should we be investing or caring about multilateral organizations? And I think it's precisely because those rules are meant to protect countries like us. We are a middle power. At the end of the day, we're not the most powerful country in the world, but we do live beside one of the most powerful countries in the world. And we need rules. We need rules that everybody agrees on. I think we have a great legal tradition in this country that also means we're frankly impactful in that conversation about what those rules should look like and how to quote codify those rules. So that's really important. And I think that's something else that has been eroded. Faith and trust in international organizations, in multilateralism has been eroded. And, we can, some might want to blame, certain countries, but I think there's enough blame to go around. It comes from the very most powerful, which have frankly too often used these organizations as their own little playground for pushing through policies that are not something that many want to go along with, or use that might is right type force. And also we have many other countries that have also similarly, seeing countries that should have no business being on the UN Human Rights Council being put on that. I mean, all of that makes a mockery of these kinds of organizations. And it's important. These organizations are important, even despite when they're flawed. In fact, that's a time not to retreat and walk away. It's a time to invest in making sure that they're functioning at the level that they should be. Because simply international organizations rarely ever die, says, as I have to remind my students. And you're better off investing that time and effort in reforming what you've got and fixing what you've got and creating also the mechanisms to ensure that it can be a sort of a living document type thing, constantly being revised, because power is not static either. And this is the problem with so many international organizations. They were devised at the immediately after the end of the Second World War, and they sort of reflect the power makeup of the times. Well, certainly that hasn't continued, not economically, not politically, not even, I think, normatively. So I think there's an important opportunity for us to play a really important part in sort of reviving those organizations.
That's a fascinating point, because there tends to be people who either rejecting multilateralism or people who are almost reflexively supportive of multilateral organizations as they are today. And interestingly, our group, after much debate, the key question wasn't, should you support multilateralism? It was, should Canada seek to radically reform multilateral institutions and processes? Because the sense was they're not actually fit for purpose in the world today. And if you live in Asia Pacific with the majority of the world's population and now the majority of the world's GDP, and you look at where these multilateral organizations are located, how many are in Geneva or New York versus how many are in Kuala Lumpur or Beijing or New Delhi? And you'd say, do these multilateral institutions really reflect us and really reflect the world? And what should Canada's role be? Should Canada's role be to say, actually the old structure, the Atlantic focus structure, suited us pretty well because actually we had a lot of sway within that structure? Or do you say, this is not viable? If we actually believe in multilateralism, we should be at the refront of the rebalancing and reforming and renewing it, rather than trying to stay with the old way, even if it means that we have to, in a sense, re-earn our relevance and legitimacy within it. And that's a pretty tough trade-off for decision makers to make. Michael, any perspective come on, because on the multilateral, you've had a number of thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think that I don't think we should give up power without getting something in return when we reform these multilateral institutions. I think that some of them are certainly in need of reform. The WTO has become ineffective. I think for the twin reason that the US has not been appointing judges to the appellate court, which has effectively stymied the entire WTO process for governing interstate disputes. I think Equally, the challenge is that China has not been has not been upholding its condition of entry into the WTO, whether it's state-owned enterprises interfering in free market economies, its manipulation of its currency, its dumping of commodities and other products around the world, thereby distorting markets. So clearly the WTO is one example of an organization that is in need of reform. I think the current government's initiative with the Ottawa Working Group is a constructive one, and hopefully with the new administration coming in, they will quickly engage with that approach and agree to reforms that will make the WTO a more effective organization. Equally, the United Nations clearly isn't performing its role. The Security Council has been completely paralyzed in recent years. There's corruption that's endemic to the organization. Bessma mentioned the way the human rights organizations are run at the UN. So clearly that organization needs to be reformed or it risks irrelevance. So I think our role is to try to work with like-minded democracies to ensure that these organizations are reformed in a way that reflects our values, reflects our interests. And I think we certainly should be accommodating broader representation at these organizations, but let's do it in a hard-nosed way that reflects our interests and our values, and not just give things up just because we feel the need to do that in an altruistic way.
I thought it was an excellent example with the WTO, because it's so fundamental to us as a free trading, mid-sized, open economy. And it's a great example where the two leading powers are both in their own way not actually playing the constructive leadership role. So it creates both the opportunity, but also the need for countries like Canada to play a more active role. And it's also, interestingly, when we were doing a review of where has Canada's capabilities diminished and where have they increased, the issue of international trade and balanced free trade multilaterally globally is an area where actually from the free trade agreement and NAFTA, and then with Europe, and then with Asia Pacific, Canada has actually become a real leader. And it's a very interesting example of a cross-partisan consensus, an issue that was so divisive in the 1990s. There's actually lock-in. And it's a place where Canada can play a critically important role. And it's a great example where multilateral institutions like the WTO and making them more effective again is absolutely aligned with our interests as well as our values. One of the questions we've been getting on chat is, what are these 10 strategic issues we keep talking about? So you can get them on the global-canada.org, but just very briefly, it's first, is it in Canada's core national interest to increase its international role and impact? Do we do international because it's nice or because it really matters? Second, at this time, should Canada surge its international engagement to reduce the chance of post-COVID global setbacks and potential systemic collapse? 3, how should Canada adapt to the changing nature of US leadership? Very appropriate this week. 4, should Canada significantly toughen its posture towards China? 5, should Canada seek to radically reform multilateral institutions and processes? 6, what leadership role should Canada play in shifting digital governance from authoritarian or corporatist models, the Beijing or Silicon Valley, and towards a democratic, citizen-focused model? 7, as a country with strong interest in Asia, should Canada make a major commitment to greater relevance within this region? 8, is Canada ready to increase its commitment to preventing crises, particularly with regards to climate change? Where Michael, you co-founded the cross-parliamentary caucus on this, and to conflict. 9, should democracy support become a more central pillar of Canada's foreign policy? And 10, must Canada strengthen and orient foreign policy processes and capabilities in Ottawa to be fit for purpose to address global engagement challenges of the 21st century? Which is a mouthful, but basically says, right now we don't have a process that results in a strategy. There's no foreign policy strategy for Canada document anywhere. There's no process such as the National Security Council review in the States, or the parliamentary, the very significant parliamentary process reviews in the UK in terms of policy impact. We have committees, we have reports, but we don't out of that have a coherent policy. And the sense was Canada is too small and the issues are too complex and all the other factors out there are too crowded and complicated for us to have a foreign policy that's either unclear or can shift with the views and perspectives of our foreign policy or a particular national government. So those were the 10 issues. Michael, as someone who may be involved in deciding on these, either in government or, depending on how processes go, as an active, engaged member of parliament, any thoughts, reflections on any of those issues?
Yeah, one of the ones that popped out at me is that we don't have a foreign policy framework that is coherent and consistent, and neither do we have a process that regularly reviews that framework to ensure that it keeps up with the times. And I think that's clear. I think you mentioned in your paper that the last major review was done by Jennifer Welch back in Paul Martin's day. And we haven't had a consistent process since then. And I think as a result, a lot of our foreign policy is inconsistent and incoherent. Just in the life of this current government, in the last 5 years, we've had 3 iterations of a foreign policy. We had Minister Stéphane Dion's, I believe he called it constructive engagement. We then had Minister Freeland give her anchor for foreign policy, which was a speech she gave in the Canadian House of Commons in June of 2018, I believe. And now, the government's undertaking a sweeping overhaul of a big part of our foreign policy, which is supposed to be the new China framework coming forward sometime this autumn. So in the space of 3 years, we've had 3 different approaches on foreign policy. And we can't keep operating this way. Look, we are a small country, as Bessma has pointed out, globally. We don't get a lot of attention on the global stage. And when we do get attention, it's really important that we speak with a clear, consistent voice. And I would argue that it's better to be wrong and consistent about your foreign policy than it is to be inconsistent and inconsistent. Because if you're inconsistent, people are just going to tune you out. They're not going to know what you actually want and what you stand for. So that's one thing that pops out at me, that we need to have a review of our foreign policy that puts in place a clear strategic framework from which everybody can work from, whether it's Global Affairs Canada, whether it's NGOs, whether it's the foreign affairs community at large, and our trading partners, our allies can all see, okay, this is what Canada wants to do. This is where it's going. We understand it, and we can coordinate in certain areas as we move forward. But we haven't had that in years, and I think as a result, we've had inconsistency and incoherence in our foreign policy.
And do you think there's an opportunity with a minority government to actually maybe put in place some of those processes?
I think that remains to be seen. This really has to be led by the government of Canada, by the federal cabinet. The minister really needs to make it clear what process is going to be put in place to do this. I think the House of Commons can perform a role as well, but ultimately it's up to the Minister of Foreign Affairs to decide how they're going, and the cabinet to decide how they're going to proceed.
Yeah, there's only so much that can be done unless the government's actively engaging. But it's true. I mean, with the minority government, there may be an opportunity, and also the Senate. In a sense, there's a number of people in the Senate now who also have foreign policy experience. And traditionally, the Senate's been completely ignored on this.
Yeah.
Compared to the United States, where the Senate has played such an important role. Is there an opportunity for something there as well?
Yeah, I think our legislature should play a much bigger role in helping inform our foreign policy. Other leading democracies do the same thing. You mentioned the United Kingdom. They've long had a robust committee on foreign policy that contributes to the development of the UK's foreign policy. As you've mentioned as well, the UK has periodic reviews of their foreign policy through their white papers. France does something similar. France has a strategic review, I think, that takes place every 5 years. And obviously in the United States, they have both processes in the executive branch of government, the White House, but also their congressional committees are quite strong in keeping tabs on their foreign policy and articulating their views on American foreign policy. We haven't had that tradition here. I think it would be a good idea for that to get kickstarted. I also think that we need to use Parliament in a bigger way to engage with our American counterparts. Power in the American Republic is a lot more diffuse than it is in Canada. It's spread, amongst amongst the White House and the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it's also spread amongst state legislatures and mayors of big American cities who have considerable power. We don't use our legislative associations nearly enough to help build those relationships, legislature to legislature. And I think, I believe, and Aaron O'Toole believes, that we need to strengthen the Canada-US intra-parliamentary association to build those people-to-people ties between members of the House of Commons and members of the House of Representatives and the US Senate. And I think that whole of legislature approach, I think, would help strengthen that Canada-US relationship.
That's very interesting. And in a sense, there was such a kind of all hands on deck during the renegotiation of NAFTA that took place, and one could see the power of it. But there's always a danger of it. It peaks and then it fades and it goes away. And I hear what you're saying is we should be locking some of these things in more systematically in an ongoing way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the government did a good job on building that capacity during the NAFTA negotiations, but at the executive level, there wasn't much of it going on at the legislative level. And look, whenever I've gone to Capitol Hill, U.S. congressmen and congresswomen, U.S. senators, they want to talk to other elected representatives, not to non-elected bureaucrats or people who don't hold elected office, because this is the basis of their system. And so we need to get more members of Parliament down to Washington to build those relationships, so that when we have issues that confront us, that we can quickly get them unstuck and get movement on them, because Congress controls so much of their foreign affairs, particularly the U.S. Senate.
They very much do. And it's true. And having legislator to legislator, and we see the role of premiers or ex-premiers is also very consequential there because of the incredibly important role governors play in the political process. A number of governors or former governors who've gone to the highest level. Bessma, what's your take in terms of the issue around the United States, which was, when we were looking at the geographic issues, number one, of course, in our group, and where there's been a lot of change in the last week, but in a way where there's also a reality of America, regardless of who's elected.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of comments on that, and I think just picking up on Mr. Chong's point here, I think that we do need to have this Team Canada approach, but recognize that there are different levers of political power. I mean, we saw some of that interesting during the USMCA negotiations, where we actually did see kind of reaching out to state governors, quite directly. And sometimes that was even more productive, frankly, than dealing with Washington, just because of the chaos that was ensuing there. And that's really smart. I mean, I think it's important to point out that power is diffused. That's really, important, but also interests are diffused, right? So, the interest of Minnesota is not the interest of Montana, and knowing that and having that really interesting strategy to be able to, I mean, I hate to be crude, but take advantage of the divisions that are there for the interests of Canada. That's what really good negotiators can do. So it's important for us to be, I think, cognizant of our next door neighbor. But I would also add in there that, there is another challenge, and it's not to be political about what's happening in the US, but populism, nationalism in the US, Trumpism, if we can call it that, as people are referring to, is very much well and alive. In fact, I really find it funny when I hear people talk about a Biden victory as though it was a landslide. And certainly in the general vote, yes, he did quite well. But the point is that even with a pandemic, Trumpism did really well, got more votes than last time in terms of his base. So what does that say? It's a rough road ahead, because that is exactly what is elected to state legislatures. That is what, increasingly we saw perhaps people who are strategic in their voting that may have voted for Republican and very populist nationalist individuals at state and local level, but opted to have perhaps Joe Biden at the presidential level. Really, the case in point here is that nationalist inward turn is really going to be tough for Canada. It really is. And I would pose it that actually it's a global phenomenon today. Countries are more introverted than ever before. The challenge for us, of course, as Canada is that we can't afford to be introverted. Our economy is very dependent on an external strategy. Our communities are increasingly multicultural and very diverse, and that means we are globalized in our very nature. And so all of that means that we're going to have to work that much harder, because everywhere else, people want to close the doors. People want to be more protectionist. And it's an inclination in hard economic times, which I'm extremely pessimistic about. I really hate to, always be chicken little on these things, particularly when it comes to the global economy, but I don't see a positive silver lining. I think we are looking at a very rough decade ahead. We've seen losses already globally that really take us back at least a decade. And so that just points to the reality that countries with that really tough fiscal space will have less bandwidth to think global, will have more interest in being introverted and taking care of their own. And we saw that. I mean, that's kind of a very, that nesting type approach is very natural to people when they're faced with the kind of crisis of uncertainty like a pandemic. So it's really, I think, incumbent on political leaders in Canada to keep this message, frequent, that the global system is worth investing in, that global engagement is to our benefit. And, it's hard. I mean, I'm not going to discount it. It's hard because, so many countries make it difficult for us to have this kumbaya attitude about how wonderful the world is. It's not wonderful. Increasingly, we see repression globally in so many quarters. We see this kind of rise of autocratic, almost chauvinistic behavior of world leaders that, we had all thought had gone away. I mean, so much of us had kind of hoped it had gone away, but it's back with a vengeance. So policymaking and foreign policymaking is that much harder today. And so it's really incumbent, I think, on Canadian leaders to just understand that it's going to be a rough road, but we need to keep the message that engagement and cooperation with global institutions and global actors is tough, but it's worth it, and we need it because it's our survival.
And it's interesting because people might have thought that now that NAFTA has been renegotiated and now that, Joe Biden's coming in, it's sort of like, woof, that was a tough few years, but we're done in terms of US challenges. When I hear both of you, you're saying, no, this is just beginning, that the pressure, the Buy America stuff is going to be as strong as ever. The need for kind of strategic, systemic, sustained engagement at every level of the United States is going to be necessary. And in a sense, we need to sell our importance to the United States, not just in terms of, we help protect some of your embassy folks in Tehran 40 years ago, or, we've done these great international things together, but here's how it actually helps put food on the table in Iowa, or here's actually how we're the most important, market for your products in this area. And it's almost like we need to go multi-local in terms of selling our relevance and our value to Americans at a time when they're going to be questioning everything international. So what I take away from you is, in a sense, is, well, actually, we should consider those last few years as just a dry run. And we should now say, what are the things we were doing intensely, and how do we gear them up, and how do we make them more sustained? And I wonder, if one does look for silver linings there, Bessma, even if we're saying that there are not that many, is if we actually reconfirm in a 21st century way our relevance to American decision makers, not only is that very important for our US-Canadian relationships, but it's also a big part of our currency internationally. Our ability to actually have voice and influence in Washington or other parts of the United States was one of the ways in which people have historically seen Canada as playing an important role, one that's been questioned for the last couple of decades. So it sounds like the U.S. situation is going to continue to be fraught. Michael, before we move to any other sort of thoughts on the U.S. and the changes of the last week or so?
Well, I think Canada needs to have good relations with whoever occupies the White House. We need to find common ground, whether it was a Trump administration or whether it is a Biden administration, on issues that matter to Canadians. 1/5 of what we do in this country is for export to the United States. 20% of our economy, 20% of our jobs, 20% of what we do as Canadians is for export to the United States. So it's an important relationship economically, it's an important relationship militarily, security-wise. It's a broad and deep relationship. And so it's too important a relationship not to work with whomever the Americans decide will lead them. I think, but I'd say that the last 4 years that America's retreat inward didn't start 4 years ago. This started long before that. And what we need to take away as Canadians is that the free ride is over. For the better part of 70 years, America protected Canada militarily, security-wise. They were benevolently willing to trade with us, to be our big brother, so to speak, on the global stage. Well, that era is over, and the free ride is over. This started with President Barack Obama. He carried out the policy of withdrawing the U.S. from global leadership. He, in a much more subtle way, he decided in 2011, for example, that in Libya, the U.S. would lead from behind. He decided that he was going to pull back from his threat to intervene with ground troops in Syria after they used chemical weapons. He called on Canada, just like the current administration has done, to spend more on its military to meet our 2% commitment, which is a doubling, essentially a doubling of what we spend on military defense. Both Republicans and Democrats have become much more protectionist in recent years. And the incoming president, Mr. Biden, he's promised to work more closely with U.S. allies, but he certainly didn't campaign on the U.S. leading the world, not on security, not on trade, not on a range of issues. So this isn't a recent trend of the last 4 years. It's been something that's been over a decade in the making. And I think we as a country need to realize that the world has changed and that we have to shoulder a bigger share of our burden. I'll just finish by saying this. One of the things I've heard in listening to many people over the last 8-9 weeks since I've assumed this role as the foreign affairs critic is that Canada needs to do less talking on the global stage and needs to undertake more action. I've heard that from both experts here domestically, but also from our allies overseas in Asia, Indo-Pacific, and Europe, that we do far too much preening on the world stage and not enough action. And so to me, in thinking through where we need to go, is that I think we need to back up a lot more of our foreign policy with hard action, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on overseas development assistance, whether it's on our own military and security responsibilities. And when you work back from that, what you really need going forward to back up foreign policy with hard action is prosperity. You need an economy that is able to afford that robust foreign policy. And I think that's something that concerns me, that we are in trouble economically. We have been for some time. We were before going into this pandemic. And it's going to be very challenging for Canada to defend its interests, to defend its values, unless we have an economy that is producing the tax revenues that we need to support that hard action, that hard power to back up our foreign policy objectives. So that's the frame that I take to this. And I want to thank you, Robert, for having me here, and Bessma as well. I've read your paper with interest, and it's been quite informative, so thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michael. Bessma, your thoughts and perspectives on that?
I know we're running out of time, so I'll just be really brief. I mean, I completely agree. And I think, we need to be careful about not having excessive rhetoric that doesn't match our capability, because that just makes us look weaker than we are. And we end up looking like we're pontificating on a world stage that doesn't do us any good. I mean, it's really important, better to say less than to talk a big game and not be able to deliver. And so we need to be careful with our words, and we have to get rid of this notion that somehow everybody wants Canada's voice on things. It's patronizing, and it doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I think and this is not to say that the world is this ocean of calm and so forth. There's certainly a lot of, I think, needless pontificating by other people who should not be pontificating. But the point here is that Canada also, we look weaker than we are when we sort of talk a big game, but then we don't kind of measure up with bringing, as Michael pointed out, the capabilities, the funding, the resources. There's no point. And so that's really, important. But at the same time, this is not an excuse to shy away from being active on the world stage. It says we need to get ourselves in order and do indeed contribute, because we do need to be there. And if we're not there, someone else is going to make the rules to our disadvantage. So we need to be there. We need to be active, but we also need to, I think, frankly, tone down the rhetoric unless we're really willing to bring up the capability aspect.
Well, I think that's a great summary for this conversation. And indeed, we've ended with what was the very first question, which was, is it in Canada's national interest to be more consequential internationally? The Honourable Michael Chong, Dr. Bessma Momani, thank you very much for this fascinating conversation. And thank you everyone for listening in and for your great questions on the chat line. Goodbye now.